Welcome to the Resilience Interview. My name is John Fawcett. Today I'm talking with Carole Adamson. Carole is a senior lecturer at the School of Social Work at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Carole was a founding member of the Australasian Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and her primary interest is in researching stress, trauma and disasters in the development of effective models of staff support within the mental health environment. Carole is a key partner in the development of professional social work curricula in New Zealand. Carole is a New Zealand Qualifications Authority monitor in 2 professional social work courses in New Zealand.
My name's Carole Adamson. For a job, I'm a senior lecturer in social work at the University of Auckland.
Yep.
So I'm a social worker by trade, and that tends to be the lens that I look at the world through.
Okay, how long have you been doing that?
I have been a lecturer for something like 26 years.
My
23 years. Maths never the strong point. Yeah, 23 years.
Wealth of experience then.
I suppose I've accumulated a fair bit, yeah. So teaching social work in 3 different universities on 4 different sites over that time. So, yeah.
And field practice as well.
Field of practice I came out of was mental health.
Right.
So when I got stuck into some specialist teaching and any research, what I was able to do was to use that mental health experience to sort of act as a base for exploring other things.
Right.
So I did my doctorate in looking at staff support systems in mental health after traumatic events and critical incidents. So sort of organisational focus on resilience and trauma and things like that.
And you've done this not just within New Zealand, haven't you?
I went and worked overseas for a couple of years as well. So most of it's a New Zealand focus, and I guess New Zealand shaped my perspectives on things like that.
Of course,
yeah.
So
but I worked in Britain as well.
Coming out of a particular cultural context, then we tend to have different ideas and perspectives on what mental health is.
Definitely. And it's only by going overseas that you actually realise just how much you have been shaped by your context. Yeah. Even though I was born in Britain, I've been kind of moulded by New Zealand.
Yes, and interesting. So, which creates its own unique meld, really, doesn't it? Of both.
Yeah, walking in both, but knowing where you belong.
Exactly, that's right. And then in New Zealand, of course, we've got a multicultural context as well, which adds a different thing to just the Pākehā European viewpoint.
Yeah, and that bicultural and multicultural perspective has sort of infiltrated and influenced, if not been completely embedded in what we do and teach and study and everything.
Oh, great. Wow, this is fascinating. Thank you for joining us. Can I keep on going by then saying, what's one of the most interesting things that you find out about resilience?
I think one of the most interesting things is actually how people like to try and define it, but how elusive it is to definition. Yeah.
Do you have a working kind of description of resilience for yourself?
Yes, I do. And I guess it's characterised by being very contextual. Yeah. Very relational and therefore really fluid. Okay. So any definition of understanding of resilience, and the traditional social work, psychosocial informed definitions are always going to be about sort of being able to withstand or bounce back from adversity. Right. Yeah. So there's sort of those running definitions, but they're coloured by that influence of the context that you're in, and
so. Sort of does that mean that resilience would look different in different contexts, or do you? Yep,
it's going to look different, and it's going to be recognised differently. Yeah,
okay, so
according to where you're standing, where the other person is standing, how well you can see into their context, and how well you recognise what resources they do have or what they don't have.
So, from my perspective personally, I might define resilience in a context. For me today, but in another context, another person might look at the same behaviours and say, no, that's not resilient behaviour, that's something else.
Absolutely.
Because of the context and the background.
Yep. And I mean, the example I often give in class is the story that I was given from Hurricane Katrina of a 14, 15-year-old girl who was one of the people from her community who was stranded on one of the overbridges when the levees broke and the floodwaters rose. And she was so impatient, along with all of her family and community, at not being rescued. Right. So she went and hot-wired a bus.
Okay.
And drove the bus and her people away from the area. And then they charged her for theft.
Of course, yes.
So that sort of resilience and adaptation to those circumstances wasn't recognised as being a strength.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, so strengths is I suppose, an important catchphrase for social workers as well. That whole sense of recognising people's strengths as resilience.
Right.
And from the outside in, the legal system didn't see her situation as being particularly resilient.
So she was using something from her repertoire of skills in order to survive and really survive and cope with a really major challenge.
It was an adaptation to the context in which she was in.
Right.
Yeah.
But viewed it from the context of law enforcement.
It was maladaptive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So the danger that crosses my mind about a kind of a description of something or other that is so fluid is that could it become meaningless?
Well, I wrote a blog post a couple of years ago about the resilience of the resilience concept.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. It was
quite fun to do, and in that I began quoting that line from Humpty Dumpty, or from Alice, and talking about Humpty Dumpty saying, "My words mean," to paraphrase, exactly what I mean and nothing else.
Right.
You know, and I think it depends on who likes to claim the word, who's captured the word as to what it actually means.
Yes.
It is therefore at risk of being a somewhat sort of nebulous and meaningless concept.
Yes.
But I think it has to be, in a funny sort of way.
And that's coming basically from your description, your earlier description about how you see resilience, is that by definition it needs to be a little bit kind of nebulous and a little bit diffuse. And if it's going to be useful.
I think resilience, a bit like the terms we use like stress and trauma.
Right.
You know, they've come out of particular knowledge bases.
Yes.
You know, the word trauma has come from physical injury.
Right.
You know, the word stress has come from sort of how much tension and pressure can you put on a steel girder before it breaks, and those sorts of things. And so that sort of capture of the power to describe something, you know, from physical sciences, can only be applied so far.
Yes.
Before it becomes meaningless when you're talking about the complex lives that we lead.
So essentially, you're suggesting that a lot of those images we have about resilience are basically either analogies or allegories, but they're really not the real. They're not the real thing.
They're always a mirror reflection or one of those multifaceted sort of. I don't know, disco ball sort of, you know, whatever angle you're looking at it is going to look very different.
Yeah.
And so that's why, coming back to that original comment I made, is that I think it's just so fascinating that people try and define it by pinning it down to a certain set of parameters.
Yeah.
But actually it's so fluid, it has to be.
Okay. Yeah. So then how useful is it in terms of working with people or communities?
I think it's useful because one of the dimensions is that we have to, in a relational sense, describe how somebody is feeling and responding to the adversities that are out there.
Okay.
So it's useful in actually being able to say, let's look at something that can build up resilience, regardless of what actually contributes to building it up.
Yep.
That resilience is a process rather than a steady state.
Oh, that's interesting. So that means if it's a process rather than a steady state, then efforts to say we're going to measure resilience here and now are going to be fraught with all kinds of risks.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll give you an example. I'm having some really interesting conversations with a PhD student at the moment who's not mine, and I'm not going to take their doctoral studies on because it's out of my field of practice. He's an engineer.
Right.
He's looking at the resilience of water supply in Iran after earthquakes.
Yep.
But he's aware that the access to water supplies is also going to be influenced by psychosocial and community conditions. Right. So he's trying to find a way of measuring the impact of psychosocial conditions like gender roles. Wow. Who would be responsible for going to get water from you know, reticulation supplies that were 5 kilometres off or something after an earthquake or whatever, you know. So he's trying to sort of, in a sense, put a hard science lens on some sorts of and a mathematical process on what are by necessity really fluid,
aren't they?
Contextually bound conditions.
They're very dynamic context, and from a systems point of view, they're constantly moving, and it'd be very hard to nail down a variable and be able to say this is the variable that makes the difference.
And the mathematicians amongst us, not me, will presumably come up with some modelling. About the relative weighting of that, but it's going to depend on where the earthquake is. What the robustness of the pipes are, but also the sort of the whole, as I say, the psychosocial elements.
Yes, exactly.
So it's so complex. Yes. That's what I love about it, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very intriguing thing, and I've heard the words resilience being used in everything from botany to ecology through to psychiatry. I mean, systems as well as individuals.
And the buzzword in for example, in disaster risk response management, etc. now is community resilience.
Yes.
And it's like the sort of, again, the engineering sciences and the town planning sciences and things, trying to adapt their understanding of resilience to complex environments. And the more the environment is complex, the less easy it is to actually pin down what resilience is, despite, I think, it still having a use as a concept.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So, but again, so what you're suggesting really is that that's another analogy, in a sense, the pure engineering measurement of how strong a piece of metal is. Applying that to a social context is an analogy, but not. It's useful, but it's not
sufficient.
Not sufficient. Yeah. So then, where do we go in terms of trying to say that either an individual or a group of individuals is more or less resilient than others? How do we work with that?
Well, I guess I alluded to it a bit before in terms of talking about it as valuing how somebody actually defines it for themselves. So I guess there's a recognition of somebody's own narrative or a community's own narrative about whether they're resilient or not. And I guess it might also be a bit comparative.
Okay.
Because if you're looking at some of the structural and systemic issues about, say, health inequalities and things like that, then what you're recognising is that it's the disparities between people's income or well-being or whatever that actually highlights when people are not in a good state. So I guess after a major disaster, when everybody is in the same position, then resilience means different things to different people. But say 5-6 years on after, say, our Canterbury earthquakes, you see the social disparities according to what resources people have been able to access, what solutions to their own issues have been found. And then you'll get a divergence of resilience, I guess.
So, from a starting point, then, if we were to say there's a group of people there that we'd like to make an assessment of resilience, sounds to me like what you're suggesting is the starting point should be with them, asking them how would they identify resilience within their context.
I think it's certainly one of the starting points, and I think it's one that might get overlooked a bit. When things are done to other people. Because if you're looking at resilience after a crisis, whether it's a personal crisis, a familial crisis, or a community crisis like a disaster, one of the things about the crisis is that people are initially robbed of autonomy and decision-making capacity and resources, but then after a while they begin to get those back. But there's a risk of not consulting them. Because they're still being done to, as opposed to generating their own solutions.
And we've both seen in context where the ability to make decisions is sort of doled out by the international community.
And you can see that in the Canterbury situation, where it became a national emergency, and where the government took control. And where over the last 2 to 3 years, there's been this debate about who's actually controlling local Christchurch infrastructure, decision making. Taking the power away from the city council to start with, and the development of the earthquake authority, recovery authority, and things.
So in the context, say, of a place like Haiti, where international agencies still basically run a lot of what happens inside Haiti, and the government is stumbles,
yeah,
then that would be kind of like a worst case scenario of external kind of control of abilities to recover.
And I guess in that situation, what you're also looking at are the pre-existing conditions.
Right.
Yeah.
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 So what we're suggesting then is there's a possibility that something that happened before this event has compromised or impacted our ability to be strong and resilient and develop that. So you add them all up together and it becomes quite a debilitating thing.
I would imagine, not having had the first-hand experience of Haiti as you have, that some of the risks about interpreting whether the communities are resilient or not are to do with those external values judgments about how corrupt a government may have been to start with. The whole debates about what international aid is for, in terms of, is it charity? Is it towards sustaining and developing sustainability within their own practices? Right. Or is it a bit of social engineering about getting that government to conform to our Western ideas about how governments should run? All those debates.
Yeah. So I mean, there's this whole cultural issue as well as the pragmatic issue, and that obviously crosses over everything that we're talking about in terms of resilience.
Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of compromising resilience or compromising the growth of resilience, are you suggesting that we need to be able to have some control over our context in order for resilience to keep on, rather than giving it all to someone else or having someone else take away that control? Is that a part of resilience?
I think for any adaptation after adversity to be able to be sustained and maintained, then there's something about autonomy, whether you're calling that as an individualised perspective for individuals in a Western context, or whether you're talking about collaborative decision making or whatever. I think it is about actually having some degree of control back over it.
So being involved in the decision making processes, if it's after an emergency, is something or other that could go some way towards restoring a community's or an individual's.
And that's the hub. That's the essence of community development.
Right.
And
would you say the same thing could possibly apply to an individual recovering from an individual event? That as they are given or encouraged to be able to make kind of decisions for themselves, that might help them develop that locus of control?
Yeah. I think the whole knowledge base about trauma is that from a physiological level up to a spiritual level, if you like, the impact of trauma is about robbing people of that sort of decision making, because the actual impact has overwhelmed somebody. And the whole therapeutic use of language, for example, or any other thing that's going to contribute to putting a distance between the physiological responses of stress and the events, to build that distance. So anything that allows people to get some control over their immediate emotional, physical reactions and things.
So is this one of the reasons why that you find the diffuse nature of a definition of resilience actually quite attractive? Because
absolutely. I mean, as a social worker and as somebody who's charged with the responsibility of explaining hyper complex concepts to students coming on courses, on social work programs, you actually have to have a knowledge base that goes from, if you like, some basic understanding of brain neurology and physiology, through to cultural and spiritual aspects, and everything in between. And what has been exciting for me over the last 10 years especially is that a lot of the literature is binding those things together. There's some really exciting stuff which talks about how the physiology of stress translates into health inequalities. And big political structural issues. This is
a cross-discipline conversations, isn't it?
And it has to be, and that's why I'm saying it's fluid, and it's contextual, and one person's resilience or one community's resilience is not going to look the same as somebody else's necessarily, but there are some core features that just bind it together.
So you'd be cautious about a grid or a so-called scientific measure that gave a number about resilience and said you're 87 on this scale.
I would be naturally cautious, in the same way that, for example, in mental health, the previous model of the DSM actually had a sort of a 1 to 100 scale.
Right.
Of
yes, it did.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and you could sort of rate somebody as a 60 or something like that. I mean, I suppose I've got a natural disinclination to quantify things like that. Yeah, and some curiosity about this engineering PhD that's trying to model psychosocial elements of resilience.
There's times, though, when I felt most lost in a situation and have felt comfort in the fact that someone can give what appears to be a kind of a concrete measure. Yeah. It somehow, okay, there is some solid ground somewhere or other.
And that, I guess, is the appeal of evidence-based practice. Right. What's worked before. Yeah. Some sorts of research processes that are going to come up with some of the evidence about, in most situations, this sort of intervention or this sort of support is going to assist. Right. Yeah.
But there may be another level beyond which, once we've done this, that we may want to explore to get a greater depth or breadth.
And that's again one of the things that we talk about in social work school in that sense, and that's the sort of the difference and the relationship between that evidence-based practice and what might be best practice. Right. Because if you like, the scientific processes of establishing evidence may not measure everything.
Yes, of course.
You know, what counts often can't be counted, etc. Yeah. That's sort of Einstein's comment, I think, or something. You know, so the best practice when you're intervening with somebody after a crisis might actually be about the way that you engage. Right. And that may not be measured by any scientific assessment about what the best intervention for their particular concerns are. Yeah.
I remember working in Africa and in the early years, the idea of sitting around a campfire and telling a story was discounted as being of any value at all. Yep. Now, the idea of story and narrative is becoming a core part of a lot of these kind of processes.
The key features of narrative and stories in terms of that lens of resilience is that they are shared.
Right. Yep.
Even if you're ruminating about something for yourself, you know, if I'm faced with a personal issue, I will ruminate, but I'm having conversation with myself. Yes. You know, so it's externalizing the conversation. Yeah. And those sorts of cultural processes of narrative are so important. Yeah.
The Western health model has largely been built on an individual model, hasn't it? Just about everything physical through to mental health.
There's I think a Croatian psychologist called Dejan Ajikovic who talked about the Western goodwill and intention about putting in counsellors and therapists after the civil war in the former Yugoslavia, and how actually the emphasis was on community rebuilding and building networks and rebuilding and creating sustainable communities so they could heal themselves, as opposed to sort of parachuting in a whole load of therapists to talk individually. And that's kind of my resistance to things like after 9/11, hearing that they're sending a whole sort of truckload of counsellors into New York City.
And I find it interesting in a sense that the same kind of scientific background that comes up with an individual-focused model also has plenty of evidence to suggest that one of the greatest protective factors is social support.
Absolutely.
And so you would think that therefore, if that's the biggest protective factor, then let's look at how people interact with other people.
The thing about putting in major social support and having a lens of things like community networks in order to aid community rebuilding and resilience is that it's political. It costs.
Right.
In the same way that within mental health, for example, if you're talking with somebody who's got a psychological concern that's open to, say, cognitive behavioural therapy, it's measurable, it's seen as a quick fix, you can account for it.
Right.
And so it fits in with, for example, government funding cycles and things like that. If you're talking about community-wide development, redevelopment, then you're talking about complex things that aren't always going to be measurable and accessible to accounting.
Yeah. Which doesn't help the bean counters.
It doesn't. Right. And no government is going to be able to say, we are justifying our budget expenditure for something that's going to take 10 or 15 years to have diverse pathways of recovery attached to it, and deliver these results.
Yeah. We've got to tie this up soon. I was just thinking about that and saying that sometimes people think that recovering from an event means they're going to get back to exactly where they were before, but that's not the case, is it?
No,
You're going to be in a different state, kind of.
You refer within the Canterbury scenario, people were using that term, the new normal.
Right.
It's about adjusting to changed circumstances. It's about recognising that grief, loss, trauma, it doesn't go away. You just learn to live with it. You perhaps reframe some of it. You may notice some what they call post-traumatic growth. You may not. It may still suck. But at the same time, it's about actually just building sufficient distance between the overwhelming emotions of the events and your daily living, so that you can actually in some way recreate a purpose in life. Whilst dealing with a heavy load that you might still be carrying. And
the recreation of the purpose in life may have outward manifestations that have a different lifestyle than they were prior to the event. It may manifest behaviourally or relationally. And I'm thinking, taking your example of Christchurch, the centre of the city is never going to look the way it was before. So many of the landmark buildings and structures have gone. And the connections that the community had with those buildings have been reshaped. So it can be a resilient community, a strong community, but it's never going to be the same. Before. And I guess symbolic of that is the debate about the rebuilding of the cathedral. Right. Which, as you know, was in New Zealand language munted. Yes. It fell down. Yeah. It is still unsafe. Yeah. And they've had debates about whether it should be rebuilt stone by stone to replicate what was before, or whether we should have something completely different, which symbolises the change and transformation and the journeys that people have gone on. And I think taking a parallel, say, with Britain and looking at the post-war recovery, there were a lot of buildings that were rebuilt stone by stone, but a lot of the iconic ones, and I'm thinking of Coventry Cathedral, was rebuilt in the 50s, 60s, in a modern architectural style which captured and immortalised and honoured some of the damage that was done, but in a new form. So this resilience then is not only stuff that's in our heads, it's actually in the real world around us. The bricks and mortar, the stones, the trees, the landscape. I mean, people use icons and symbols. And I guess it's another way. Symbols are another way of externalising, of being able to focus on saying, it's like having memorial days. And war memorials and peace memorials and things like that. So you talked about social connectivity, but you're also talking about contextual connectability, aren't you? The environments within which we live, we need to be connected to those. And those environments will have meaning. They'll either have meaning from what they gave us or what we give them, or both. I mean, you're a visitor in my house here, and you look at my house differently. I look at my house and I look at everything here, and it all has meaning. It has history, it has stories attached to it. It's relational according to who's given me what and that sort of thing. And so if you invite people in for a longer time, then they begin to learn some of those meanings, but they also then give some meanings to those things as well, don't they? Yes. And so when I get too old and decrepit to run my own household, and my kids have to come in and negotiate my moving into sheltered accommodation or something, part of the importance for my resilience is going to be their understanding
what is important to me.
Yeah.
And it is not just about material things,
No,
it's
no.
about that sort of sense of connectedness and the stories that go with that.
I think I could go on forever, and so could others. But is there anything else in closing that you think that you'd like to tell us about resilience that either emphasises what you said before or adds to it? We can always come back for another session.
I think I've said quite a lot there, and you know, there's lots of different layers of meaning in that term resilience, really. Yeah. I think the things that I try and say in summary are that, as I said at the beginning, it's contextual, it's relationship-based or relational, and it's fluid. Yeah. And yet I can talk about my own resilience and the resilience of the people I know. Yeah. So it means something, but it's not something that you can parcel up neatly. Yeah.
Thank you, Carole. It's really fantastic.
It's been a pleasure and fun.
I look forward to doing it again sometime.
Okay.
Today we talked with Dr. Carole Adamson, Senior Lecturer at the University of Auckland. For more Resilience interviews, go to the Resilience channel on YouTube or the resiliencecheck-in.com website.